Dr. Sarah stepped off the transport ship and felt the cold air hit her face like a slap. The research station on 442B was a massive metal structure sitting on a frozen wasteland. Ice covered everything as far as she could see. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds that promised snow. Sarah pulled her thick jacket closer and walked toward the main building. Other beings were also getting off different ships. She had never seen so many different alien species in one place before. Some walked on 2 legs like her, others had 4 or 6 legs. Some had fur, others had scales or shells. A few even seemed to be made of crystal or metal. Inside the station, a tall blue alien with 4 arms greeted everyone. "Welcome to the Galactic Coalition survival test," it said through a translator device. "You are here because your species wants to join our colonization program. We need to know if you can survive on harsh worlds." Sarah looked around the room. 12 different species had sent representatives. She was the only human. Most of the other beings were much larger than her. Some had thick fur or natural armor. Others carried advanced equipment that hummed with energy. A crystalline being that looked like walking diamonds spoke up. "I am Zax of the. Our thermal generators can create perfect climate bubbles. We do not fear cold." The crystal creature's voice sounded like wind chimes. An insect-like alien with 6 arms and green shell armor clicked its mandibles. "The hive has developed exoskeletons that regulate temperature better than any natural body. We are ready for any environment." A blue-skinned being with gills on its neck gurgled through a water-filled helmet. "The Empire brings heating systems that can warm entire buildings. Your primitive worlds cannot challenge our technology." Other aliens showed off their equipment: energy shields, heat rays, environmental suits that could survive in space. Each species seemed confident that their advanced technology would easily handle whatever test the coalition had planned. Sarah said nothing. She had brought a backpack with basic winter clothes, some simple tools, and materials that most humans would recognize from camping stores. Compared to the alien technology around her, her gear looked like toys from a museum. The blue host led them to a viewing room with large windows. Outside, they could see a testing area the size of several football fields. It was completely empty except for scattered rocks and snow. "The test will last 72 hours, the host explained. "We will create weather conditions from the worst storms recorded on hostile planets across the galaxy. Your job is simple: survive. You may use any equipment you brought. You may build any shelter you can make. But once the test starts, no help will come until it ends." Zax the crystal being laughed, a sound like breaking glass. 72 hours. Our generators can run for weeks." The insect clicked happily. "Our exoskeletons need no external power. We could survive months." The gurgled agreement. "Our heating systems are designed for deep space exploration. This will be easy." Other aliens nodded and made confident sounds. They looked at Sarah with what might have been pity. How could a soft human from a warm planet compete with their advanced technology? Sarah just smiled and checked her backpack one more time. Inside were things her grandfather had taught her to use when they went camping in Alaska. A small shovel that folded up, a knife for cutting, some rope, matches in a waterproof container, a small oil lamp, basic winter clothes that could be layered, and knowledge that her species had learned over thousands of years of surviving ice ages. The host started explaining the rules in more detail. They could not damage the station. They could not interfere with each other's survival efforts. They could not use weapons against other participants. The testing area had cameras everywhere that would record everything. "Weather simulation will begin in 1 hour, the host announced. Temperature will drop to -60 degrees. Wind speeds will reach 200 kilometers per hour. Snow and ice will fall continuously. This represents the worst storms from 12 different hostile worlds." The aliens began checking their equipment one last time. Energy cells were charged, heating systems were tested, shields were powered up, everything beeped and hummed with advanced technology. Sarah put on her basic winter jacket and pants. She tied her boots tight and put on thick gloves. She checked that her small tools were easy to reach. Then she picked up her backpack and walked toward the exit that led to the testing area. An alien that looked like a walking tree made a sound that the translator said was laughter. The human thinks basic clothing will save her. How amusing. Another alien, covered in thick purple fur, shook its head. Humans come from such an easy world. They know nothing about real cold. Sarah heard the comments but did not respond. She had read the files about all these species. Most came from worlds with stable climates. Their home planets did not have ice ages or extreme weather. They had developed technology to control their environments instead of learning to live with harsh conditions. But humans were different. Her species had survived ice ages that covered most of their planet in ice. They had learned to live in deserts, jungles, mountains, and frozen lands. They had spread across every environment on Earth not because they had the best technology, but because they could adapt. The hour passed quickly. Sarah and the other participants stood at the entrance to the testing area. Outside, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. The wind was starting to pick up. "Test begins now," announced the host. The aliens rushed outside with their equipment. Most immediately turned on their heating devices and energy shields. The testing area filled with the glow of advanced technology. Sarah stepped outside calmly. She felt the cold wind hit her face and took a deep breath. Then she began walking slowly across the snow, looking at the ground and sky. She was not looking for a place to hide from the storm. She was looking for the right place to build her home. The storm hit like a wall of ice and fury. Within minutes, the testing area became a white nightmare of wind and snow. The temperature dropped so fast that Sarah could see her breath freeze in the air. The wind howled like a living thing, pushing snow sideways and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah pulled her hood up and kept walking. She was looking for something specific, the right kind of snow in the right kind of place. Most people did not know that not all snow was the same. Powder snow was too light. Wet snow was too heavy. She needed snow that was just right, packed enough to hold together but not so wet that it would freeze solid. Around her, the aliens were struggling with their technology. She could hear electronic beeping sounds getting more urgent. Lights from energy shields flickered in the storm like dying stars. The crystalline named Zax had set up his thermal generator first. It created a warm bubble around him that melted the falling snow. But as the melted snow hit the ground, it turned to ice. Soon he was standing in the middle of an ice pond that kept getting deeper. Worse, the moisture in the air was condensing on his crystal body. Ice began forming on his arms and face. "Generator power dropping," he said to his communication device. "Moisture is causing system overload." The insect had activated their exoskeleton's heating systems. The green shells glowed red with heat, but the extreme cold was making the metal brittle. Small cracks appeared where the joints bent. Cold air rushed through the cracks, hitting the soft body underneath. They began shivering, something their species had never evolved to do. They was having the worst problems. Their heating system was designed to warm water, not air. The device kept trying to heat the space around them, but the wind blew all the warm air away immediately. Meanwhile, the water in their breathing helmet began freezing at the edges. Ice crystals formed on the inside of their face mask. Other aliens faced similar troubles. The tree-like being's heating device could not keep up with the wind speed. The furry purple alien's natural coat was getting soaked with snow that then froze solid, making them unable to move properly. A slug-like creature with advanced environmental suits found that their life support systems were using power faster than expected. Sarah ignored the chaos around her and kept searching. She found what she was looking for about 50 meters from where the others were struggling. a small rise in the ground that would protect her from the worst wind. And most important, the snow here was perfect. It was dry enough to cut into blocks but packed enough to hold its shape. She took the small folding shovel from her backpack and began testing the snow depth. About 3 feet down, she hit frozen ground. Perfect. That was deep enough to cut blocks and give her a solid foundation. The wind was getting stronger now, and the temperature was still dropping. Her face was numb with cold, but her body was warm from walking and working. This was important. She had learned from her grandfather that staying active kept you warmer than any heater could. Sarah began cutting into the snow with her shovel. She made careful rectangular blocks, each about the size of a large brick. The blocks held together well. Good snow. Her grandfather would have been proud. As she worked, she could hear the aliens on their communication devices. They were calling for help, reporting equipment failures, asking how much longer the test would last. Some were already talking about giving up. Human settlement protocols require immediate extraction, one voice said through the storm. Exoskeleton failure at 60%, requesting emergency power supplies, said another. Life support critical, cannot maintain temperature, gurgled a third. Sarah said nothing. She just kept cutting snow blocks and stacking them in a careful pattern. She had done this before during camping trips with her grandfather in Alaska. The key was patience and understanding how the blocks would settle together. After an hour of work, she had cut enough blocks to begin building. The storm was still getting worse. The wind was so strong now that it knocked over 2 alien heating devices. The thermal generator finally overloaded completely and shut down with a shower of sparks. Sarah started laying her foundation blocks in a circle about 8 feet across. Each block had to be placed just right, tilted slightly inward. This was the most important part. If the foundation was wrong, the whole structure would collapse. The aliens who could still see through the storm watched her with confusion. They whose exoskeleton was now more cracks than shell clicked a question into their translator. What is the human doing with frozen water? Sarah heard the question but did not stop working to answer. She was adding the second row of blocks now, each one tilted a little more inward than the one below. Slowly, the walls began to curve inward, forming the bottom of a dome. A cat-like alien with heating claws that had stopped working managed to get close enough to watch. She is building a shelter from snow, it reported to the others. How can frozen water keep out the cold? The tree-like alien, whose heating system had failed 30 minutes ago, made a creaking sound that meant disbelief. Impossible. Snow is cold. Cold cannot protect from cold. But Sarah knew something they did not. Snow was not just frozen water. Snow was tiny air pockets trapped between ice crystals. Air was an insulator. Good snow could actually keep warmth in and cold out if you knew how to use it. She continued building, row by row. The dome shape was important because it was the strongest structure for holding weight. The curve would let the wind flow over it instead of trying to knock it down, and the thick walls would trap warm air inside while keeping cold air out. By the third hour, most alien equipment had failed completely. The testing area was littered with broken heating devices, dead energy shields, and emergency shelters that had been torn apart by the wind. The aliens were huddled together in small groups, sharing what little warmth their failing technology could still provide. Sarah placed the final blocks at the top of her dome, leaving a small hole for air circulation. Then she cut a low entrance tunnel that would keep the wind from blowing directly inside. The tunnel curved up into the main chamber, creating a cold trap that would keep the warm air from escaping. She crawled inside and lit her small oil lamp. The flame flickered at first but then steadied. The temperature inside was already warmer than outside. In a few hours, it would be comfortable. Through the storm, she could hear the other participants calling for extraction. The test was supposed to last 72 hours, but most aliens were ready to quit after just 4 hours. Sarah settled into her snow shelter and smiled. The real test was just beginning. Inside her igloo, Sarah worked steadily to make her shelter perfect. The small oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the curved snow walls. The flame was tiny, but in the enclosed space, it made a surprising difference. The temperature was already 10 degrees warmer than outside, and it was still rising. Sarah took off her outer jacket and hung it on a small hook she had carved into the wall. This was another thing her grandfather had taught her. If you stayed too warm inside winter clothes, you would sweat. Wet clothes in cold weather could kill you. Better to be comfortable and dry than hot and damp. She could hear the storm still raging outside. The wind made howling sounds as it passed over her dome, but inside, the air was calm and quiet. The curved walls deflected the wind perfectly, just as she had planned. Sarah pulled out her communication device and checked on the other participants. The screen showed their locations scattered across the testing area. Most were huddled together in emergency shelters that looked like small metal pods. These shelters were keeping them alive, but the readings showed they were burning through power supplies very quickly. The Zax was in the worst shape. His crystal body conducted heat too well, and without his thermal generator, he was getting dangerously cold. The emergency shelter was keeping him alive, but ice crystals were forming on his surface. This exoskeleton was now completely cracked. The insect inside was curled up in a ball, trying to conserve body heat. Their emergency shelter had heating, but it was not designed for this level of cold. They was having trouble breathing. The water in their life support system kept forming ice crystals that clogged their breathing apparatus. They had to keep melting the ice with small heaters, which used up power very quickly. Sarah shook her head sadly. These beings were all intelligent and capable, but they had never learned to work with cold environments. They only knew how to fight against them with technology. She began making improvements to her igloo. First, she used her breath to create a glaze on the inner walls. She breathed out warm, humid air and let it freeze in a thin layer on the snow. This created a vapor barrier that would keep moisture from escaping and would reflect her body heat back to her. Next, she arranged her sleeping area. She laid down a small tarp to keep moisture from soaking through, then added her sleeping bag on top. The sleeping bag was rated for extreme cold, but more importantly, it was designed to work with body heat, not against it. Sarah took out her small camping stove and made herself some hot tea. The warm liquid felt good, but the real benefit was psychological. Having hot food and drink made everything feel less like survival and more like camping. As she sipped her tea, she activated her communication device's teaching mode. This was something she had not planned to use, but watching the other participants struggle made her feel bad. Her grandfather had always said that knowledge should be shared, especially when lives were at risk. "This is Doctor," she said into the communicator. "I am broadcasting on open channels for any participants who want to listen. I would like to explain how my shelter works." There was silence for a moment, then a flood of responses. "Human, your primitive shelter cannot possibly be effective," came Zax's crystalline voice, but there was curiosity in it. "The readings show your shelter is warmer than ours," admitted the. "How is this possible?" "Please explain," gurgled the. "Our heating systems are failing." Sarah smiled and began her impromptu lesson. "First, you need to understand that snow is not just frozen water. Snow is millions of tiny air pockets trapped between ice crystals. Air is an excellent insulator when it cannot move around." She held up her communication device and showed them the igloo's interior. The dome shape is important for two reasons. First, it is the strongest shape for supporting weight. The blocks support each other in compression, so the structure gets stronger as you add more blocks. Second, the curved surface deflects wind instead of fighting it. The cat-like alien, whose claws had stopped working hours ago, asked, "But how does frozen water create heat?" It does not create heat, Sarah explained patiently. It traps heat. My body produces heat naturally. The igloo keeps that heat from escaping. The thick walls of snow insulate better than most advanced materials because they are full of dead air space. She pointed to the small oil lamp. This lamp produces very little heat, but in an enclosed space, every bit of warmth counts. The key is not to fight the cold, but to work with it. The tree-like being made creaking sounds of confusion. But snow is cold. How can cold things keep you warm? Sarah thought about how to explain this simply. Think of snow like a thick blanket made of air. The air itself is not warm, but it stops your body heat from escaping. The colder the snow, the more air it traps and the better it insulates. She showed them how she had built the entrance tunnel. This is called a cold trap. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. The tunnel entrance is lower than the main chamber, so cold air stays in the tunnel while warm air stays in the chamber. The mandibles clicked with interest. Your species learned this through evolution. No, Sarah said. We learned it through experience. For thousands of years, my ancestors lived through ice ages. They could not build heating machines, so they learned to use the environment itself. This knowledge was passed down from parent to child for hundreds of generations. She took another sip of her tea and continued. The most important thing is to stay dry. Wet clothing conducts heat away from your body very quickly. That is why I took off my outer jacket when I came inside. If I got too warm and started sweating, my clothes would become wet and dangerous. An alien that looked like a walking rock formation asked, "How long can such a shelter last?" "With proper maintenance, an igloo can last for months," Sarah replied. "As long as the temperature stays below freezing, the structure actually gets stronger over time. The walls freeze solid but keep their insulating properties." She heard several excited conversations in alien languages as the participants discussed what they were learning. Some asked technical questions about block cutting and dome construction. Others wanted to know about the physics of thermal insulation. Sarah answered all their questions patiently. She explained how to test snow for building quality, how to cut blocks that would fit together properly, and how to create ventilation that would not let heat escape. "The most important lesson," she said finally, "is that survival is not about having the best technology. It is about understanding your environment and working with it instead of against it. My ancestors survived ice ages not because they were strong or smart, but because they learned to adapt." Outside, the storm continued to rage with no sign of stopping. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind was now strong enough to blow over large equipment. But inside her igloo, Sarah was warm, comfortable, and dry. She looked at her communication device and saw that several aliens were trying to learn from her lesson. Some were attempting to build their own snow shelters, though without proper tools or experience, their efforts were clumsy. Sarah finished her tea and settled into her sleeping bag. Through the thin snow walls, she could hear the storm that was defeating some of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, but she felt safe and peaceful. Her grandfather would have been proud. The old ways still worked, even among the stars. Sarah woke up after 8 hours of comfortable sleep. Outside, the storm was still raging, but inside her igloo, the temperature had stabilized at a cozy 15 degrees Celsius. Her small oil lamp had burned through the night, providing just enough heat to keep the air warm and comfortable. She stretched and checked her communication device. The readings from the other participants were not good. Most had been awake all night, huddled in their emergency shelters and burning through power supplies to stay alive. Several were showing signs of hypothermia despite their advanced technology. The Zax was in critical condition. His crystal body was conducting heat away faster than his emergency heater could replace it. Ice crystals were growing on his limbs, and his communication signals were getting weaker. The situation was also serious. Their exoskeleton was now completely useless, and the insect body inside was not designed for cold weather. They were surviving only because their emergency shelter had a small fusion heater, but the power cell was already at 50%. Sarah made herself a hot breakfast using her small camping stove. Oatmeal with dried fruit and nuts, plus another cup of tea. The warm food made her feel ready for the day ahead. She had more than enough supplies to last the full 72 hours comfortably. As she ate, she decided to do something that went beyond just surviving. These beings were suffering because they had never learned the basics of cold weather survival. Their advanced technology had made them dependent, but it had also made them vulnerable. When their machines failed, they had no backup knowledge to fall back on. Sarah activated her communication device in teaching mode again. "This is Doctor calling all participants. I would like to offer a comprehensive lesson on thermodynamics and survival techniques. Consider this a formal lecture." The response was immediate. Even the beings who had been dismissive before were now eager to listen. Their lives might depend on what they could learn. "I am broadcasting from inside my snow shelter," Sarah began. "Current interior temperature is 15 degrees Celsius. Exterior temperature is minus 68 degrees. I am comfortable, dry, and using minimal energy resources." She held up her communication device to show them the interior of her igloo. The space looked impossibly cozy compared to the storm outside. The curved walls glowed softly from the lamp light. Her belongings were neatly organized, and she was sitting comfortably in her sleeping bag wearing only light clothing. "First, let me explain the fundamental principles of heat transfer," she said, settling into her teaching voice. "Heat moves in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Most advanced heating systems fight against all three, but smart design can use these principles to your advantage." The whose breathing apparatus was still clogging with ice asked, "How does your shelter address these heat transfer methods?" "Conduction is heat moving through direct contact," Sarah explained. "The snow blocks in these walls conduct heat very slowly because they are full of air spaces. Each air pocket acts as a barrier to heat transfer. That is why thick snow insulates better than thin ice." She pointed to her sleeping area. "I am not lying directly on the snow floor. This tarp and sleeping bag create air layers that prevent my body heat from conducting into the ground." "Convection is heat moving through air currents," she continued. "My dome shape prevents wind from circulating inside. The entrance tunnel acts as a cold trap. Dense cold air stays low, while lighter warm air rises and stays in the main chamber." The cat-like alien, who was now sharing an emergency shelter with two other beings, asked, "What about radiation?" "Radiation is heat moving through electromagnetic waves," Sarah said. "The glazed interior walls I created with my breath act as a heat mirror. They reflect my body heat back to me instead of absorbing it into the snow." She stood up and showed them how she had arranged her space. "Layering is critical for survival. I wear multiple thin layers that trap air between them. When I am active, I remove layers to prevent sweating. When I rest, I add layers to stay warm." The clicked questions about the physics involved. Sarah was happy to explain. "The key insight is that your body is already an excellent heater. Adult humans produce about 100 watts of heat continuously. That is like a bright light bulb. The trick is keeping that heat around your body instead of letting it escape." She demonstrated her clothing system, showing how each layer served a specific purpose. Base layer to wick moisture away from skin, insulating layers to trap warm air, outer shell to block wind and snow. "Your species evolved heating technology because you never needed to survive ice ages," Sarah explained. "Humans had to learn these techniques or die. For thousands of years, we survived winters that would kill most galactic species, even without any technology at all." The tree-like alien made curious creaking sounds. You said your ancestors survived ice ages. How is this possible without heating machines? Sarah smiled. They understood that the human body is incredibly good at generating heat. They just needed to keep that heat from escaping. They built shelters from whatever materials were available: snow, animal skins, stones, even mud and grass. She pulled out her grandfather's old hunting knife and showed them how she had cut the snow blocks. This knife is over 100 years old. The design has not changed much in thousands of years because it works perfectly. Sometimes simple tools are better than complex ones. The most important survival skill, she continued, is reading your environment. I tested the snow quality before building. I chose this location to avoid the worst wind. I watched the weather patterns to understand how the storm would develop. A slug-like being whose environmental suit had failed asked, "How do you know so much about weather?" Human ancestors had to predict whether to survive, Sarah explained. We learned to read cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, and dozens of other natural signs. This knowledge was so important that we developed sayings to help remember it. Red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning. She spent the next hour teaching them about weather prediction, explaining how humans had learned to forecast storms by watching nature. Cloud types, wind direction changes, pressure patterns that could be felt in your bones. Your technology can predict weather accurately, she said, but what happens when the technology fails? Humans learned backup methods for everything important. The aliens asked dozens of questions. How do you find safe drinking water? How do you signal for help without electronic devices? How do you treat injuries with natural materials? How do you navigate without instruments? Sarah answered each question patiently, explaining techniques that human children learned from their parents and grandparents. Knowledge that had been passed down for thousands of generations. The real secret, she said finally, is not fighting against nature but working with it. Your heating machines try to create summer in the middle of winter. That takes enormous energy. My igloo just prevents winter from getting inside. It uses winter's own tools against winter. The Zax, whose crystal body was barely functioning, asked weakly, "Could you teach us to build these snow shelters?" Sarah looked at the readings from their emergency equipment. Most aliens would not survive long enough to build proper shelters, even with instruction. Their emergency shelters were keeping them alive, but barely. "I will do better than teach you," she said. "I will help you build them." She put on her outer jacket and checked her tools. "Anyone who wants to learn hands-on construction, move your emergency shelters closer to my location. We will build proper shelters together." Several aliens began moving their emergency shelters through the storm. It was dangerous, but they were running out of power and options. Sarah smiled as she prepared to go back outside. Her grandfather had always said that the best way to learn survival was to do it with someone who already knew how. It was time to put that wisdom to the test among the stars. Sarah spent the next day and night helping alien participants build basic snow shelters. It was slow work because most of them had never used simple tools before. They kept trying to cut snow blocks with surgical precision when rough cuts would work better. The cat-like alien was afraid to get snow on their fur. The tree being moved too slowly because they were used to roots, not hands. But slowly they learned. Sarah showed them how to test snow quality by squeezing it in their hands. She taught them to cut blocks that tilted inward naturally. Most importantly, she showed them how to work steadily without overheating in their winter clothes. By the second night, 5 aliens had crude but functional snow shelters. They were not as elegant as Sarah's igloo, but they worked. The beings inside were warm, dry, and safe from the storm. More importantly, their emergency power supplies were no longer draining away. The Zax had the hardest time learning. His crystal body was not designed for physical labor, and he could not understand why imperfect blocks would work better than precisely cut ones. But with help from Sarah and two other aliens, he managed to build a small shelter that kept the wind out. "This is impossible," he kept saying as his body temperature stabilized. "Primitive materials should not work better than advanced technology." "They do not work better," Sarah explained patiently. "They work differently. Your thermal generators are incredibly powerful and efficient, but they need perfect conditions to operate. These shelters work in any conditions, but they need knowledge and effort instead of power." The storm continued for the full 72 hours, just as promised. During the last day, Sarah organized practical exercises. She taught them to make fire from basic materials, to melt snow for drinking water without wasting fuel, and to layer clothing properly. Some aliens were better students than others, but all of them learned something useful. When the storm finally ended, the testing area looked like a disaster zone. Broken heating devices were scattered everywhere, half buried in snow drifts. Failed energy shields lay cracked and dark. Emergency shelters that had run out of power were covered in ice. But scattered across the area were small domes of snow that had protected their occupants through the worst storm conditions in the galaxy. The extraction teams arrived exactly on schedule. They found Sarah sitting outside her igloo, calmly eating breakfast and watching the sunrise. She had slept well, used less than half her supplies, and was completely unaffected by the test. The aliens who had learned to build shelters emerged tired but healthy. Those who had relied only on their emergency equipment needed immediate medical attention for hypothermia and exhaustion. The blue host alien who had greeted them 3 days earlier looked stunned as the medical teams worked. "We expected the human to be the first casualty," it admitted to Sarah. "Your species comes from such a moderate world." Sarah smiled as she packed her simple tools back into her backpack. "Earth is not moderate. Earth is extreme in many different ways. Humans learn to survive in deserts where the temperature reaches 60 degrees, in frozen lands where it drops to -40, in mountains where the air is too thin to breathe, and in jungles where everything is trying to kill you." The extraction team's medical officer, a being with 6 eyes and tentacles for arms, was examining the aliens who had learned shelter building. "Remarkable," it said. "These participants show no signs of cold stress despite having inferior heating equipment." "Their equipment was not inferior," Sarah said. "It was different. Technology is a tool, but knowledge is a survival skill. When technology fails, knowledge keeps working." The Galactic Coalition's assessment committee arrived that afternoon to review the test results. They were a group of important-looking beings from different species, all carrying advanced data tablets and looking very official. The committee chairperson, a floating jellyfish-like creature, announced the preliminary results. "Based on energy efficiency, environmental adaptation, and survival time, we must completely revise our assessment criteria." Sarah had used less energy than any other participant while maintaining perfect health and comfort. She had also successfully taught survival skills to other species, proving that human knowledge could benefit the entire galactic community. The human participant not only survived but thrived in conditions that disabled advanced heating technology, the chairperson continued. Furthermore, she demonstrated teaching abilities that preserved the lives of other participants. The whose exoskeleton was being repaired by technicians clicked a formal statement. "The Hive requests permission to learn human survival techniques for our colonization program." The breathing freely now that their equipment was working again, gurgled agreement. "The Empire also requests access to human knowledge." Other species made similar requests. Even Zax, despite his species' pride in their thermal technology, admitted that human techniques would be valuable backup systems. The committee chairperson made the final announcement. "Dr. Sarah, The Galactic Coalition offers you the position of Director of Environmental Adaptation. Your job would be to teach survival techniques to all species in our colonization program. Sarah thought about the offer. It would mean traveling to different worlds, working with alien species she had never met, and teaching skills that her grandfather had taught her during camping trips in Alaska. "I accept," she said, "on one condition. I want to establish survival training centers that teach practical skills, not just theory. Students need to get cold and wet and tired. They need to make mistakes and learn from them." The committee agreed immediately. Within a month, the first Galactic Survival Academy was being built on a harsh world with extreme weather conditions. Students from dozens of species would come to learn the ancient human arts of adaptation and survival. Sarah stood in the planning room, looking at blueprints for the new academy. The aliens wanted to build it with the most advanced materials available, but Sarah had different ideas. "Make it simple," she told the architects. "Use basic materials and simple tools. If students learn to survive with advanced equipment, what happens when that equipment breaks?" She pointed to a section of the blueprint. "Here, build a traditional human log cabin. There, construct shelters from local materials. Students will learn to work with what they find, not what they bring." The architect clicked confusion. "But doctor, surely we should provide the best possible learning environment." Sarah smiled, thinking of her grandfather's old hunting knife and the igloo that had saved her life. The best learning environment is one where students discover that they are stronger and smarter than they knew. Advanced technology can make life easier, but it cannot make people more capable. 6 months later, the first class graduated from the Galactic Survival Academy. Students had learned to build shelters from ice, sand, wood, and stone. They could start fires without electronic ignition, find water in desert conditions, and navigate by stars when their instruments failed. Most importantly, they had learned that survival was not about having the right equipment. It was about having the right knowledge and the confidence to use it. Sarah stood on the Academy's main platform, watching a group of young aliens practice building snow shelters. They were clumsy but enthusiastic, making the same mistakes that human children made when learning these skills. She thought about her grandfather, who had taught her that the old ways were not obsolete. They were foundational. Technology could enhance human capabilities, but it could never replace human adaptability. The galaxy was full of hostile worlds that needed to be colonized. Now, thanks to ancient human wisdom, alien species would be ready for whatever challenges they found among the stars. And sometimes, Sarah reflected, the most advanced thing you could do was remember how to be simple.